I'm Tiffany. The conference room reeked of burnt coffee and lavender hand cream, a scent blend I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. The lavender wafted from my husband's attorney, who wrung her hands like she was about to snap a wishbone. The burnt coffee smell emanated from the building, and the overwhelming stench of fear? That was seeping into the room, but it wasn't coming from me. I watched as my husband's lawyer, Miss Thompson, sifted through the evidence I'd submitted to the court earlier that morning. Her face morphed through every hue imaginable, starting pink, then turning deathly white, and finally a sickly yellow that made me genuinely worry she'd faint right onto the polished oak table. Beside her, my husband, Ethan, sat stone still. The self-satisfied smirk he'd strutted in with at 9 o'clock sharp vanished by 9:42. By 10 o'clock, he wasn't even glancing at the paperwork anymore, his eyes were fixed on me. For the first time in our 13-year marriage, I think he truly saw me. This was the man who'd kicked me out of the house I'd purchased with my inheritance, the man who'd told our son, Oscar, at the breakfast table that he was a burden he was glad to be rid of. Over the past 6 months, he'd painted me as a paranoid alcoholic unfit to care for our own child. But now, the realization dawned on him. He hadn't stripped me of everything, I'd let him believe he had. And that distinction was about to cost him his fortune. Let me rewind. Before I became a hapless wife, I was Tiffany Reed, a sharp-witted fraud investigator. I worked for a prominent insurance firm in Miami for 10 years. I was like a bloodhound chasing down fraudsters. I'd put away people who staged elaborate plane crash hoaxes and caught unscrupulous contractors who billed for repairs they never made. Once, I helped convict a man who was laundering money through a chain of art galleries. It was a wild case, and my boss often joked that I'd be an excellent witness against myself if I ever went rogue. I'd laugh it off, never imagining it would come in handy. Then, I had Oscar. He was born premature with a congenital heart defect. At just 20 months old, doctors found a hole in his tiny heart. He's had 2 surgeries already, and he'll need another before he turns 13. He takes medication morning and night, and he tires easily when playing with his friends at school. When Oscar was admitted for his first surgery, Ethan broke down in the hospital cafeteria and pleaded with me to quit my job. Please, be there for him. I make enough to support us all, he sobbed. Exhausted and in love, I believed him. We were a team, or so I thought. Ethan runs a high-end event planning company his grandfather founded in the 1960s. He inherited it when his father passed away. He's tall, with this charming smile that used to make my heart melt. He loves to laugh at his own jokes and has a way of making people like him. In the first decade of our marriage, I thought he hung the moon. But in the last 3 years, cracks started to appear. It was a Tuesday in April when Ethan came home and dropped the bombshell. I was in the kitchen, taking a batch of cookies out of the oven, and Oscar was at the counter, building a Lego tower. Ethan stumbled in, still wearing his expensive Italian shoes, which I'd asked him countless times not to wear indoors. He didn't even take off his coat. I filed for divorce, he declared. I want the house, the cars, and everything in the accounts. I've hired Langston and Pierce, the top divorce firm in the city. You should just sign the papers because you don't stand a chance. Langston and Pierce. Their billboards were everywhere, and they charged a hefty $1,000 an hour, even for their junior associates. You didn't hire them unless you had something to hide and deep pockets to pay for the cover-up. I stood there, dumbfounded, still clutching my oven mitts. I think I mumbled something about the cookies getting cold, but I can't be sure. What I remember vividly is what Ethan said to Oscar. Oscar had stopped building his Lego tower and was looking up at his dad with a confused expression, like he was waiting for the punchline. Ethan looked down at him and sneered, "You'll be fine, kid. I'm not your babysitter. You're nothing but a medical liability." Oscar's eyes welled up with tears. He was always a quiet, sensitive boy. He didn't wail or throw a tantrum, he just shed these small, embarrassed tears, as if he was sorry for being such a disappointment. I rushed across the kitchen in a blur and scooped him up, even though he was getting too big to be carried. I took him to his bedroom, sat on the floor with him on my lap, and rocked him back and forth. I whispered in his ear over and over again that he was the most wonderful thing in my life, that everything his father said was a lie, and that we were going to be okay. He fell asleep in my arms, still in his school clothes, his damp hair sticking to my neck. When I returned to the kitchen, Ethan was on the phone in the living room, laughing obnoxiously. I heard him say, "Yeah, she's taking it like a champ. No fight at all." I stood in the hallway, listening as he talked about me like I was a problem he'd finally solved. Something cold and still awoke inside me, a part of me that had been dormant for 10 years. The next morning, his mother, Mrs. Mitchell, showed up at my door with a clipboard. She'd always been a cold, distant woman. She'd never once offered to help when Oscar was in the NICU, or when I got pneumonia a few years back. But that day, she rang the doorbell at 8 a.m. Sharp, wielding a clipboard and a measuring tape. I've always wanted to redecorate the living room in a darker shade of blue. "When can I send my designer over?" she asked sweetly. I stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious?" I asked. She smiled that condescending smile of hers and said, "Ethan has been very clear. You have 48 hours to pack your things and leave. I don't want any drama for Oscar's sake." The woman who'd hardly ever held her own grandson was using his name to push me out the door. "Where do you expect me to take a child with a heart condition on such short notice?" I asked. She shrugged and replied, "I'm sure your parents have a spare room." That night, I sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of tea in front of me, and I reflected on the past 13 years. The more I thought, the more something didn't add up. Ethan's company had grown exponentially since I quit my job. He was constantly jet-setting to events in Paris, New York, and Dubai. New luxury cars filled our driveway every year, but our joint bank account showed little to no growth. Whenever I asked about saving for Oscar's education, he'd say the business needed the money. When I suggested a family vacation, he'd claim cash flow was tight. Last winter, when my car needed new tires, he told me to drive carefully until the next bonus. Meanwhile, he was driving a brand new $80,000 Mercedes. I'd ignored these red flags for years, because I trusted him, because I was exhausted from taking care of Oscar, and because I didn't want to seem like a nagging wife. But after what he'd said to Oscar, I couldn't turn a blind eye anymore. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I went into Ethan's home office, a room he'd always kept locked. He'd hidden the spare key in the most obvious place, taped to the back of his desk drawer. I sat in his leather chair, inhaling the faint scent of his expensive cologne, and started going through his files. I read tax returns, loan applications, and the company's private financial records for hours. By 3 a.m. I was no longer crying, I was making a list. The next morning, I called my college roommate, Lily. She's a senior forensic accountant for the government. I told her everything that had happened and what I'd discovered. She didn't hesitate. "Pack a bag for Oscar." "I'm on my way," she said. Before Lily arrived, the doorbell rang. It was a courier with an envelope from the health insurance company. It was a notice that, effective immediately, Oscar had been removed from Ethan's policy. This was the same policy that had covered his surgeries and medications, which cost $520 a month out of pocket. I sat on the front step in my pajamas, holding that envelope, and a strange calm washed over me. Ethan hadn't just left me, he'd pulled the rug out from under our son. He'd been planning this for weeks, while I was still baking him cookies and taking care of our family. Lily arrived at 6 p.m. With 2 suitcases and a bottle of tequila. She set up camp at my dining table and didn't leave for 3 days, except to eat and sleep. By Sunday night, we had a 4-inch thick binder full of evidence. What we found was far worse than I'd imagined. Ethan had been funneling money through a fake event equipment rental company set up under his cousin's name in Nevada. The fake company billed his event planning business for equipment that was never delivered. His company paid the invoices, and the money was then transferred to a personal account in the Cayman Islands. Over 8 years, he'd siphoned off over $800,000. There was also a credit card. The statements were sent to a P.O. box he'd rented under his assistant's name. The card had been used at a luxury resort in the Maldives 15 times in the last year, at high-end jewelry stores, and at a private spa in the Hamptons. It was clear he'd been having an affair. Lily and I knew we needed a lawyer who could take on Langston and Pierce. Lily knew just the person, Miss Harding. She was a 63-year-old legal powerhouse with a tiny office above a pizza parlor on Main Street. She'd defeated Langston and Pierce in 5 different cases over the past 12 years. When I sat down with Miss Harding, she looked through the first few pages of the binder, took off her glasses, and said, "Oh, honey, your husband is in deep trouble and we're going to fight for you." Ms. Harding's strategy was simple: make Ethan think he was winning. When Langston and Pierce sent over their first insultingly low settlement offer, she responded with a meek letter asking for more details. When Ethan called to gloat, I pretended to be weak and defeated. "I just want what's best for Oscar," I pleaded. He ate it up, completely unaware that I was building a mountain of evidence against him. Meanwhile, I got back to work. 2 of my old colleagues had started their own investigative firm, and they were more than happy to bring me on as a consultant. It wasn't a full-time job, but it gave me enough money to rent a small apartment near Oscar's school and keep him on insurance through the marketplace. About a month before the court hearing, something unexpected happened. Ethan's bookkeeper, Mrs. Jenkins, showed up at my apartment with a lasagna. She was a sweet, elderly woman in her 70s who'd worked for the company since Ethan's grandfather was alive. She sat down at my kitchen counter and slid a thumb drive towards me. "I've been waiting for someone to expose him," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. My husband passed away last year, and I'm too old to play these games anymore." The thumb drive contained every piece of evidence I needed: emails between Ethan and his cousin about the fake invoices, deleted text messages to his mistress, and financial records that showed he'd falsified the company's income for years. Ms. Harding was ecstatic when she saw the thumb drive. "In 30 years of practicing law, I've never seen evidence like this fall into our laps," she said. "We made copies of everything, one for the court, one for the IRS, and one for Ethan's 2 business partners, who'd been in the dark about his fraud for years." On the morning of the hearing, I woke up at 4 a.m. I forced myself to eat a slice of toast, dropped Oscar off at school, and told him I loved him and that everything would be okay. The courthouse was in the heart of the city, a grand old building with marble floors that echoed with every step. I wore a simple black dress and my grandmother's pearl earrings. Ms. Harding wore a sharp gray suit. We didn't look like we were about to win, and that was the plan. Ethan walked in at 9 a.m. Sharp, flanked by 2 lawyers, his mother and his mistress, a 25-year-old blonde named Chloe. Chloe was wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my car. Mrs. Mitchell sat behind Ethan, looking like she was at a high society event, taking notes in her little notebook. The judge, Judge Sullivan, was a no-nonsense woman in her late 60s with gray hair and a stern look. She'd heard it all, and I could tell she wasn't easily impressed. Langston and Pierce's lead attorney went first. He spoke for an hour, painting Ethan as a loving father and a dedicated businessman. He used the word devoted so many times it lost all meaning. He also mentioned my unstable mental state and how it was in Oscar's best interest to be with his father. I almost laughed out loud, but Miss Harding squeezed my hand under the table. Then, it was Miss Harding's turn. She stood up, calm and composed, and began to present our case. She started by showing the judge the bank statements that proved I'd used my inheritance to pay the down payment on the house. Then she moved on to the evidence of Ethan's fraud, the fake rental company, and the hidden offshore account. With each new piece of evidence, Langston and Pierce's attorney looked more and more nervous. When Miss Harding introduced Mrs. Jenkins as a witness, Ethan's face went pale. Mrs. Jenkins sat in the front row, looking as sweet and innocent as a church lady. She testified about how Ethan had pressured her to falsify the financial records and how she'd kept copies as insurance. Ethan tried to interrupt, claiming it was all a lie, but Judge Sullivan cut him off. Mr. Mitchell, I've seen your type before. Save your breath, she said. As the hearing progressed, Chloe got up and walked out of the courtroom, never to return. Mrs. Mitchell's mouth hung open, and she stopped taking notes. It was clear their world was crumbling around them. 2 weeks later, the judge made her ruling. I was awarded sole custody of Oscar, the house was transferred into my name, and I received 85% of the marital assets due to Ethan's fraud and perjury. Ethan was ordered to pay full child support based on his real income, which was more than double what he'd previously reported. His business partners filed a civil lawsuit against him, and the IRS launched an investigation into his financial affairs. Langston and Pierce dropped his case, citing a conflict of interest. In the months that followed, things started to get better. I went back to work full-time, and my firm offered me a promotion. Oscar's heart condition improved, and he was able to play more sports with his friends. We adopted a dog named Max from the local shelter, and he became Oscar's best friend. One day, I ran into Ethan at the grocery store. He looked smaller, not physically but in spirit. He tried to say something, but I just looked at him and walked away. There was nothing left to say. I'd said it all in that courtroom. Looking back, I realized that I lost myself in my marriage. I stopped paying attention to the signs, thinking I was being a good wife by trusting and supporting him. But I'm not that woman anymore. I'm Tiffany, a survivor, and I'm going to make sure that Oscar grows up knowing that being kind doesn't mean being weak. Justice may be slow, but when it arrives, it brings justice and closure. And I'll always be grateful to the people who helped me along the way, especially Mrs. Jenkins, who decided it was time to speak up and hand me the hammer I needed to fight back.